Hey, this is week 6, lecture 3. So far, we've talked about the first 4 movements of missional living. We talked about beholding. We talked about being emptied out. Last lecture, we spoke about listening and cultivating narrative awareness. And then we finally talked about naming systemic needs of a community. Now, what I want to shift to is then once we've begun to name those systemic needs, we quickly begin to realize that we are, as leaders, not capable of making all the changes necessary for the community that God has called us to affect and impact. So, what that requires, and this goes back to why we did the missional leadership prior to this part, because if you've been trained in a hierarchical organization, the release of power and creativity may be a challenge to us. And so, what we have to do is that we have to begin to believe that God has called around us a team of people with different gifts and graces that can, under the right circumstances, conditions, and equipping, impact the needs of a community in a way that is so much different than that any one of us could do by ourselves. And so we've got to cultivate or foster, and this goes back to some of the previous lectures that we've talked about. We've got to cultivate or foster environments of missional creativity where the people of God themselves can feel inspired and empowered to dream about the ways in which they can employ the gifts and graces that God has given them to impact change within the community. Let me give you an example of how I saw this missional empowerment work. We were in a church in Toronto called The Sanctuary. And if you read the book, and I really hope some of you would read, uh, uh, by Greg Paul, it's on your reading list. God in the Alley, sorry. Couldn't think of the name. God in the Alley, and I really hope it's a short book, and I think a lot of you would find it very, very interesting as a read for urban ministry context. If you would read that for your last book, but in this, we stayed at this place called the Sanctuary down in downtown Toronto, and it's a place that ministers to the transient, the homeless, the drug addicts. And they do it through a number of different ways. They do what they call drop-ins, and they can drop in for food a couple times a week. They do a full meal for them. It's served family style, which is beautiful because it cultivates relationships there, and it's just amazing. But one of the other things they identified is a couple of the people in the church had a gift, and that gift was art. And the leaders empowered missional creativity to think about what are the ways in which they could use their gifts to influence and affect change in the lives of those that God was bringing through their doors. And they began to realize that art in of itself has this therapeutic capacity because it gives the ability to give expression to some of the most visceral feelings and emotions that maybe they can't even explain in words. And so a couple of those people, not the leaders themselves, but a couple of the people that were a part of the sanctuary community, believed that they could then utilize the gifts and graces that God has given and encourage and create a space for healing to take place as people begin to work through their stories through the artwork that they produce. So they have art drop-ins led by some of the leaders there, or led by some of the missional agents there in the church who are simply utilizing their gifts and graces to impact change. So what in what ways do you invest your life in the church community to empower missionally the creativity that is already latent within that group? Um, who can think of, dream of, and receive visions from God in ways that engages some of those systemic needs that you alone as the leader may never dream up or think up because God has already placed that on the heart of someone else. Until we cultivate a leadership um, philosophy that makes that empowerment the priority, we will often strip our people of their greatest capacity and potential to make a difference for the sake of the kingdom. Now that's number 5. This empowerment of missional creativity. But move 6 is consistent with this. And what move 6 says is that if I'm going to empower missional creativity, then me as a leader, my role shifts, and we've talked about this a little bit in some of the lectures. My role shifts, and now I am an equipper, right? So then I'm making investments in my missional agents. I'm cultivating and creating atmospheres for creativity. I'm training and equipping our people to listen well and behold well the systemic needs of the community that we find ourselves. And I'm investing myself as a leader in other people, training and equipping them and helping them to find a level of confidence and competence in what God is calling them to do within the life of the community. So I want to challenge you to begin to think of what are the pathways or the pipelines through which I faithfully, intentionally, and strategically equip my leaders. If all I'm doing is one-offing meetings with people who are in my leadership or who have the capacity to be difference makers, and I'm just meeting with them here randomly and having a coffee with them here randomly, uh, you may be able to speak into and encourage, but I think each of us needs to think through what is our pathway. What is a strategic, intentional process of investment in leaders for the purpose of utilizing their gifts and graces to further the mission of God? And so we do that in our context in a program called 12 for 20 that we developed, in which we take 12 leaders through a program. They spend 20 weeks with me, and I invest in them for 20 weeks to empower them to become disciple makers out in the community, out through the people that we reach and the lives that we impact, the people that we touch. We make an intentional, strategic investment in those that we believe that God has created for the capacity to make a missional difference in the community. So it's okay to talk about empowering environments of missional creativity, but a lot of our people like, okay, but what do I do with that? That's where we have to take our role as equippers very seriously and recognize that if we equip well, we are going to exponentially raise the bar on people's capacity, removing ceilings of insecurity or incompetency to be able to empower those gifts and graces to affect change in creative ways missionally within a community. And so, and that may not happen within your church. Some of the people that you'll invest in and equip will then go do that in the marketplace. They'll do that in the community organization that they're serving in. Think about this. If you identify that within your community, fatherlessness is an issue, and you've invested and equipped and trained a person who is a coach of young people in a community where fatherlessness is a problem, then what you've done, even though they're not hosting a program at your church or even involved in quote unquote a ministry of your church, they are doing ministry through the kingdom of God from your church out in the community, meeting needs that you've identified are systemic needs within the community. So you are exponentially impacting and becoming a change agent in a way that wouldn't be if you just started a new program at your church. So think about the ways that you can empower those who are already in your community, making a difference and impacting and affecting change. So far, we've beheld, we've looked deeply, stared deeply into the brokenness of our community. And from that, we've emptied ourselves out, right? And then we've cultivated listening or a narrative awareness of what we hear about the community that we live in. We've named the systemic needs and we've empowered missional creativity. What is it going to look like to tackle those systemic needs? Who do we need to partner with? What do we need to develop? And now we're talking about equipping and empowering those that have that missional capacity, that creative capacity to affect change. So those are 6 moves. We've got 2 more, 1 more lecture, and then we'll finish up for this week.